on Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, a short history lesson filled with biased and irrational thinking. I just finished reading the 2014 book by Yuval Noah Harari entitled Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. I read it in part because several colleagues of mine have expressed to me that it is a book of great importance and profound thinking. One of those colleagues from time to time sends me excerpts from the book attempting to prove some point or the other. For the most part, I enjoyed the book. I also appreciate the work and effort Dr. Harari put into writing this book. The book is informative and thought-provoking. The author tells us in the first chapter that the book attempts to tell the story of three revolutions that have affected humans: the cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution, and the scientific revolution. I'm not sure the book adds anything to someone who has spent time studying history. In 416 pages, he covers the history of mankind from the dawn of time to the present and adds in a few thoughts about the future. Included are his observations and opinions of historical matters. Given that Barbara Tuchman took just over 1,000 pages to tell us what happened in the 14th century, Dr. Harari's book leaves a lot out. The problem I do have with the book is Dr. Harari incorporates into his narrative descriptions of historical events many explanations that reflect his own political bias and viewpoint. As an example, he describes the migration of peoples from Indonesia to Australia some 45,000 years ago as an invasion. How could he know it was an invasion? If they were the first people to settle in Australia, were they really invading? And even if there were people in Australia 45,000 years ago, were there enough people to call the immigration of a few Indonesians an invasion? When the Germans marched into France in 1940, that was an invasion. I don't think a boatload of Indonesians landing on the Australian shore 45,000 years ago qualifies to be called an invasion. Why does Dr. Harari use the word invasion? Because if a boatload on Indonesians 45,000 years ago is an invasion, then every boatload of Europeans who landed on distant shores throughout the last 700 or so years is an invasion. The connotation is that the invaders are not good, so therefore the Europeans, who were invaders for 700 years, are also not good. Strangely makes no mention in his book of the invasion that has occurred and continues to occur in the United States and Europe, where tens of millions of illegal immigrants have stormed across borders. He suggests that the modern state is a nationalist myth. While a few nations may be founded on myths, Viking gods, or supernatural beings, most nations are nothing more than a group of people with a common language and common customs who live with a specified geographic area. I understand what he is getting at. A nation is a myth because it is a human construct. We have many human constructs that help us survive and prosper. Gallons are human constructs. Meters are human constructs. Speed limits are human constructs. Does that mean that gallons, meters, and speed limits are myths? Try telling a police officer that the speed limit is a myth next time you're getting a ticket. Why does Dr. Harari use the word myth to describe nations? Because myths are typically not true. St. Patrick didn't chase the snakes out of Ireland, and George Washington did not have wooden teeth. As we all know, myths are not true. Therefore, if nations are a myth, nations must not be true. In other words, nations don't exist, and those who support nations or nationhood are fools or gullible like the people who believe in myths. Interesting that he refers to nations as myths several times in his book, but he never refers to a global world government or global world order as a myth. The book states that religion can thus be defined as a system of human norms and values that is founded in a belief in a superhuman order. Based on his description of a religion, he then goes on to say that certain political and economic ideologies are religions. He mentions communism, capitalism, Nazism, and nationalism. He conveniently leaves out globalism, environmentalism, climate change, activism, feminism, LGBTQ+ activism, and progressive leftism. Throughout the book, he emphasizes this idea of these ideologies as being religions, repeatedly throwing capitalism and nationalism in with the horrors of communism and Nazism, but again, never mentioning the religions of globalism, environmentalism, climate change activism, feminism, LGBTQ+ activism, and progressive leftism. Dr. Harari comes up with his own definition of religion and uses it to conclude that capitalism and nationalism are religions. But what is religion? A Google search will tell you that there are many definitions, but a common theme is the belief in superhuman powers and a god. Note that Dr. Harari replaces superhuman powers and God with superhuman order. I don't think those things are the same. Further, does capitalism even incorporate a belief in a superhuman order? I don't think so. Capitalism is simply a system of organizing the productivity of humans. A person or business combines materials and labor that cost X and then sells the resulting product for X plus for their own benefit. I don't see anything superhuman about it. In fact, a 10-year-old running a lemonade stand can do it without any superhuman intervention. I have chosen just a few examples, but Dr. Harari's book includes many more. His book is full of such wordsmithing. He manipulated the English language in a manner that supports his worldview. Europeans who arrived on distant shores were not settlers, migrants, or refugees. They were invaders. People who believe in nations and support their country are misguided. Because there are no countries, because countries are a myth. Capitalism and nationalism are religions, but apparently not globalism, environmentalism, climate change activism, feminism, LGBTQ plus activism, and progressive leftism. And as religions are based on unfounded beliefs as opposed to observable facts. Even his third revolution, the scientific revolution, is an odd choice. His second revolution, the agricultural revolution, was in effect a scientific revolution. Our ancestors learned that applying science to the growing of crops, watering, fertilizing, pruning, pollinating, would allow crops to be grown and yields to increase. The last revolution wasn't a scientific revolution. It was a capitalist revolution. Because without the capitalist system, it is very probable much of the scientific knowledge we have gained in the past 500 years would never have trickled down to help the average person. Another concern about Dr. Harari's book is his discourse on capitalism. He spends 75 pages describing capitalism, and much of it is negative. On the very first page of chapter 16, he introduces his capitalist example with a financier named Samuel Greedy. Wars, ruined states, colonialism, and even the slave trade were the result of folks like Samuel Greedy and other nasty capitalists. There is little mention of the benefit the capitalist system and free enterprise have created for people around the world, including eradicating disease, lifting people out of poverty, improving standards of living, providing opportunity for creating wealth, and bringing us all manner of conveniences and devices that enhance our enjoyment of life. Meanwhile, his discussion of communism and its toll on human life in the 20th century, including the deaths of about 100 million people in Russia and China, gets one sentence on page 379. He says in his book that 10 million African slaves were brought to America. No, 400,000 slaves were brought to the United States of America. 10 million may have been brought to the New World, including South and Central America. But he knows most people, when you say America, think of the United States of America, particularly people who do not live in the U.S., not both North and South America. Why does he make this inference? Because anyone reading it will think the British who control the U.S. colonies were terrible and Americans by default were terrible, but he passes no judgment on the Spanish Empire. Now, 22 Spanish-speaking countries south of the U.S. border that imported most of 10 million slaves. He finished the book on a sad note. To quote, he states, "Unfortunately, the Sapiens regime on Earth has so far produced little that we can be proud of." I disagree. Despite its winding path with 2 steps forward and 1 back, what started off in a cave roughly 10,000 years ago has culminated in Western civilization, a collection of social norms, ethical values, traditional customs, religious beliefs, political systems, technologies, and science, developed primarily in Western Europe and the United States of America. I'm very proud of that. The language techniques used by Dr. Harari allow him to pass judgment on people who do things or believe things he doesn't like or doesn't approve of, like believing in nations, capitalism, God, and the virtues of Western civilization. It is his method of rationalizing his own worldview against the worldview of others. It's unfortunate because his book would have been much better if he just stuck to giving us a history lesson and not tainting it with his own personal and, in my opinion, misguided bias.